Material deprivation continued. Diet and health. So Marilyn Howard notes that young people from poorer homes have lower intakes of energy, vitamins and minerals. And this affects their achievement. Not only does it weaken the immune system, which leads to more absences at school, but it also leads to less concentration in lessons. Richard Wilkinson argues that children from poorer homes are also likely to have emotional or behavioural problems. Among 10-year-olds, the lower the social class, the higher rate of hyperactivity, anxiety and conduct disorders, all of which have a negative effect on the child's education. So a clear conduct or hyperactivity disorder that we will know of is ADHD. So another aspect of material deprivation is financial support and the actual costs of education. So we've already looked at the fact that EMA has disappeared and the effect that this has had on the working classes who perhaps cannot afford the resources and the bus fares to get to college. So from that perspective, we're looking at similar aspects. So we're looking at three main sociologists who consider these different issues. The first is David Bull. He argues that school costs, and school costs because children have to pay, parents of children have to pay for equipment, they have to pay for school trips, and they have to pay for uniform. And he refers to this as the costs of free schooling. And children may miss out on experiences such as school trips if they can't afford it. The costs of items such as transport, uniforms, books, computers, calculators and sports equipment place a heavy burden on poor families. So Flaherty talks about stigmatisation. Because people may not be able to afford the correct equipment, poor children may have to deal with hand-me-downs and cheaper but unfashionable equipment, which may result in being stigmatised or bullied by peers. Such equipment may be really essential for self-esteem or to fit in for school. It might seem trivial, but for some children it may make them feel isolated at school and may lead to underachievement. Fear of stigmatisation may also help to explain why 20% of those eligible for free school meals do not take up their entitlement. Ridge found that children in poverty are more likely to take on jobs such as babysitting, cleaning and paper rounds, and that this too has a negative impact on their schoolwork. The financial restrictions may explain why many working class children leave school at 16 and why relatively few go on to university. Also, fear of debt may deter poor students from applying to university, as students from poorer families may have experienced their families being in debt and may not want that for themselves. Students from poorer families starting university can expect to leave with substantial debts. Dropout rates are also higher for universities with a large proportion of poor students. For example, 13% at Sunderland, a university with a large working class intake, dropped out compared to 1.4 at Oxford. So in the rest of the screencast, we're going to be looking at cultural deprivation and cultural factors. Again, in your essays, you may be required to contrast the two and make a decision on which one you think is the most important factor. So, cultural deprivation theorists, as I said earlier, are functionalists. So we can broadly put anybody who talks about cultural deprivation into the functionalist camp. And cultural deprivation theorists look at three things: intellectual development, language, and attitudes and values. So we're going to start off by looking at intellectual development. So cultural deprivation theorists argue that many working class homes lack the books, educational toys and activities that would stimulate a child's intellectual development. So children from such homes start schools without having developed the intellectual skills needed to progress. J.W.B. Douglas found that working class pupils score lower on tests of ability than middle class pupils. He argues this is because working class parents are less supportive of their children's intellectual developments. They're less likely to read with them or get involved in other educational activities in the home. And then finally, Douglas Young argued that the way mothers think about and choose toys have an influence on their children's intellectual development, with middle class mothers more likely to choose toys which encourage thinking and reasoning, and working class parents or working class mothers less likely to choose educational toys. The next aspect we are looking at is language. So Burita and Engelman argue that the working class have a different kind of language than the middle classes. They are likely to communicate in gestures, single words and phrases. They are incapable of abstract thinking, and as a result they find it difficult to use their language to explain, compare or analyse. And because of this, they're unable to take advantage of the opportunities at school, because if you can't use language fully, then you can't express yourself and you can't actually develop the skills required for the education system. So Bernstein continues the idea of Burita and Engelman, but he goes into a lot more detail. You might come across Bernstein in your English language syllabus, because Bernstein was mainly a linguist, and he found that there were two speech codes: the restricted speech code and the elaborated speech code. The restricted speech code is characterized by limited vocabulary. It often uses short, unfinished or grammatically simple sentences, and speech is quite often predictable. It may involve a single word or even just a gesture. So the restricted speech code is context bound. It assumes the speaker assumes that the listener shares the same set of experiences. So people may use the restricted speech code in different circumstances, and it's not just the working class that might use restricted speech code. Lovers might use restricted speech code because they may assume that their other half understands them, so they don't need to develop their ideas. And we might use restricted speech code amongst our friends as well. The elaborated speech code, Bernstein argued, was used more by the middle classes, and the elaborated speech code was characterised by having a wider vocabulary. It's based on longer, grammatically more complex sentences. Speech is varied and it communicates abstract ideas. It is context free, so the speaker does not assume that the listener shares the same experiences, and as a result, they use the language to spell out their meanings and make those meanings clear. So these speech codes give the middle classes a clear advantage at school and put the working classes at a disadvantage. So the working classes who've been taught the restricted speech code at home are unable to develop skills of analysis and evaluation. They may feel excluded at school, and as a result, they are less successful. Whereas the middle classes who have learnt an elaborated speech code at home have already had a head start, because the elaborated speech code is the code which is used in the education system. So the elaborated speech code is used by teachers, textbooks, and by exams. It's seen as the correct way to speak and write. So to be successful in the education system, you need the elaborated speech code because it's an effective tool for things like reasoning, analysis, and evaluation. And lastly, we're looking at attitudes and values. And when we look at attitudes and values, we're looking at subcultural explanations. So by subcultural explanations, we mean explanations that argue that the working classes have a particular subculture, which is a culture within a culture. The working class is a culture within a culture because they do not share the same attitudes and values as the rest of society. So Douglas looks at attitudes and values, and he uses some evidence to support his point of view. He conducted a longitudinal study from 1964 to 1970. He followed 5,362 British children born in 1946 through primary school to age 16. So basically, a longitudinal study is a study which is conducted over a reasonable period of time. So he divided the students into groups according to their ability, and he divided them into 4 class groups. He found within the high ability group, 50% of the students from the lower working class left secondary school in their 5th year, compared with 33 from the working class and 22% from the middle class, and then 10% from the upper middle class. So as you can see, if you're from a lower working class background, you're more likely to leave school early. However, you could argue his conclusion may have been flawed because he interpreted it to mean that this was due to the aspirations of working class parents, and that working class parents had lower aspirations for their children, when in reality, from what we've looked at when we've looked at material deprivation, we could come to a different conclusion, and we could argue that children from lower working class families may actually leave school due to poverty and not cultural values. Hyman we've come across before when we've looked at Hyman and Sugarman and immediate gratification. So Hyman argues that the values and beliefs of working class are a self-imposed barrier to educational success. By that, Hyman means that the values and beliefs of the working class stop the working class from being successful, and it's the working class's fault. They place little value on achieving high status jobs, and they are less willing to make sacrifices, and as a result they leave early to take on manual work. The subcultural values mean that they neither want success nor do they actually know how to get it. And then finally, Sugarman also looks at attitudes and values. So we've come across Sugarman before, when we've looked at immediate gratification. We normally look at Hyman and Sugarman together because their ideas are actually quite similar. So Sugarman comes up with 4 things or 4 values that the working class hold. One is fatalism. That's a belief that there's nothing you can do about your situation, and therefore you have to accept your situation. The second is collectivism. For the working class, belonging to the working class is very important, and so the working classes perhaps put that before individualism, which is all about competing in the education system. Thirdly, immediate gratification. Immediate gratification is wanting pleasure in the here and now, and that you're not prepared to put off pleasures for future pleasures. And then finally, present time orientation, which links very clearly with immediate gratification. We think in the present and we don't plan for the future. So immediate and present time orientation may lead to young people who are working class leaving education system to pursue a job because they want the money in the here and now, and they're not prepared to sacrifice that by going to university and having a better job with a better salary. Sugarman argues that these differences in values exist because of the different types of jobs that the middle class and working class do. So for the middle class, they have secure careers offering prospects for continual individual advancement. This encourages ambition, long-term planning, and a willingness to invest time and effort in gaining qualifications, By contrast, working class jobs are less secure and have no career structure through which individuals can advance.